Excuse me, can I have your attention, please? I would like to open the session now. I would like to give some remarks and introduce myself, and then I think we will hear from the speakers as was in the program. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Member of Parliament, Leonidas Donskis, and the European Foundation for Democracy to this hearing on Syria and human rights today in the Parliament. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you, and I'm looking also forward later for questions and thoughts from your side. Just to introduce myself, my name is Daniel Trautvetter, and my organization, the European Foundation for Democracy, is dedicated to supporting through research, communication and advocacy, freedom, democracy and human rights. As part of our activities, we are also monitoring closely the situation of human rights in Syria, and it has remained over the years an issue of great concern to us. It is also my pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel today. So we have on the right Maureen Thomas from Amnesty International UK, long-standing campaigner for human rights defenders and human rights in Syria. Then we have next to her Maleh. He is the son of the well-respected human rights lawyer and human rights defender in Syria, Maleh, who is imprisoned since October 2009, and Ias is also very active in the field of human rights. To my left, we have Malik Al-Abdeh. He's a director. Yeah, he's a director at the Movement for Justice and Development, based in London. And then we are still waiting for our fourth speaker, Terry, from the FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights, who will arrive shortly. I thank you all very much for speaking today, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts and suggestions. By way of opening, I just want to raise one point. I think we all know that the situation of human rights and human rights defenders in Syria is quite serious. We also know the political context that the association agreement with Syria entails a human rights clause that at least some people hope would lead to an improvement of human rights in Syria. Now the agreement is not yet signed by Syria, but we also see that so far it does not lead to a real improvement or sort of a change in the situation of human rights and human rights defenders in Syria. So this is certainly one of the points that I'm sure will be raised by the speakers and also come up in the discussion. So now I have the pleasure of giving the floor to Maureen Thomas. I think we will hear some very interesting remarks and a very interesting speech. Thank you very much all, and the session is open. Maureen, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Donskis and Roberta and Daniel for organising this event and allowing me to come here today. I want to try to put a human face on one of the human rights activists, political dissidents and prisoners of conscience presently incarcerated in Syria's terrible jails. Dr. Kamal Lavwani is not just a political and human rights activist, but a gentle, loving husband, father, son and doctor. He cares greatly about his patients and is distressed by the poverty so many of them endure and the fact that health provision in Syria is inadequate to deal with many of their medical needs. He loves to be in the open air. I don't know if you can see, but in his own garden he has fruit trees and he loves to be amongst them. He needs to express himself by painting. He's also an artist. and he needs to paint, and of course he can't at the moment. He will also very willingly do washing up, wash dishes. But this is how he is now, and how he has been for 4.5 years, and he has more than 10 years still to serve. He has a wife, 3 children, and an elderly mother, and he loves them all deeply. He feels very, very guilty about the suffering he is causing them by his absence, and because of the retributions they suffer as a result of his actions. For example, shortly after Dr. Labani's arrest, the family's home was broken into, the sanitary ware was smashed, and the electric circuit rewired so that turning on a light produced a dangerous electric shock. The perpetrators deliberately left signs, clues behind to let the family know it was the work of the security police. Dr. Labani's wife has been forced out of her job by the security forces, and in order to make money to survive, the family live in the basement of their house and let the upper floors to tenants. Dr. Labani's elder daughter was not allowed out of the country to study, and although she has now graduated from a Syrian university, she is not able to find work. His younger daughter completes her studies this year, and it is unlikely that she will fare any better. But most of all, Dr. Labani worries about his 18-year-old son, who has had his father at home for only a few months over the past 10 years. I know Dr. Labani personally because my group of Amnesty International was asked to support him as our prisoner of conscience back in 2001. At that time, he was serving 3 years in solitary confinement for attending seminars where democratic reform was discussed. After his release, I made contact with him and arranged to put on an exhibition of his paintings in my hometown of Basildon in the United Kingdom, because he was not allowed to show his work in public in Syria. The Syrian authorities had banned him from leaving the country after his release, but he did manage to get out in August 2005 and stayed with me for 6 weeks while his paintings were being exhibited. After that, he came to Europe and to this Parliament. He was also invited to visit the White House, but he thought long and hard before agreeing to go there, as he knew his motives would almost certainly be misinterpreted by the Syrian authorities. But he believed he had to risk his freedom in order to take the opportunity to tell the US government that any acts of aggression against Syria, which were then being promulgated, would be totally unjustified, as it would be the ordinary people of Syria who would suffer. He gave the same message to everyone else he met, that the opposition inside Syria could itself bring peaceful democratic reform to the country if only it were given diplomatic support by the outside world to help it gain the right to speak and to meet in public. Dr. Labani's friends and family begged him not to return to Syria in these states, but he is an honourable man, and his personal integrity would not allow him to stay free while his friends and colleagues were being picked up off the street, beaten and incarcerated. So he flew back to Damascus, and his friends and family watched helplessly as he was picked up at the airport and driven off in a police car. He disappeared for 4 days in November 2005, during which time he was beaten and starved in an attempt to make him reveal information about the Hariri tribunal, although he knew nothing about it and had not been involved in it in any way. While in prison, awaiting trial, Dr. Labani had his head shaved, and also his complexion became very yellow and he developed skin sores as a result of being put in a rat-infested underground punishment cell for weeks without daylight. The cell had no proper sanitary provision, no washing materials, no proper bedding, and there was inadequate clothing and food. Western diplomats do try to attend the trials of political prisoners, and this is a positive action. But their attendance at the trials is portrayed in the Baathist media as tacit approval of the Syrian regime's treatment of its dissidents. Therefore, after observing a trial that fails to meet international fair trial standards, and their nations need to state this and register their protests. Dr. Labwani now spends his time in a cell intended for 32 prisoners, but which in fact contains anything between 60 and 90 violent criminals who are rewarded for harassing him and giving false evidence against him. The prisoners are allowed out of their cells for only 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. Political prisoners are not allowed to make contact with each other. They are each held in a different cell with criminal offenders. The food is of very poor quality, and although the prison is situated in a semi-desert area and hot in the summer, the men are allowed only 1 5-minute shower a week. Unlike the criminal prisoners, Dr. Labwani is not allowed to visit the library and is not permitted to speak to his family or his lawyers without 2 security guards listening to their every word. Dr. Labwani suffers from prostatic hypertrophy, and the medical facilities in the prison are totally inadequate to deal with this, or with Riyadh Saif's prostate cancer, or with Haytham Maleh's diabetes and overactive thyroid, or Anwar al-Buni's chronic rheumatoid arthritis, or Ali al-Abdullah's perforated eardrum, which is a result of the beating he received while being interrogated. Pious platitudes by Western governments calling on the Syrian government to respect the human rights of its citizens are insufficient. Specific actions must be taken immediately by Western governments to support the political prisoners, such as calling for their immediate and unconditional release, demanding that they be visited periodically by independent medical experts, urging the immediate suspension of Syrian laws that criminalize the fundamental rights to freedom of expression and association. The Syrian government seems to hold its own legal system in contempt. When challenged, Syrian officials, from the president down, always declare that the Syrian constitution protects the human rights of all its citizens, including those in prison. But what they fail to know is that since 1963, the emergency laws have superseded the constitution, and these emergency laws allow the country's 4 security agencies to act with impunity. Legal procedures are ignored, and beatings and torture of those in detention are commonplace. I have personal experience of the Syrian government's disregard of its legal system. Immediately after Dr. Labwani was sentenced in 2007, I petitioned the United Nations Working Group on arbitrary detention on Dr. Labwani's behalf. They passed the facts of my claim as stated in the petition to the Syrian government. The Syrian government's response to the United Nations was full of inaccuracies. Not inaccuracies that necessarily painted them in a better light, just plain inaccuracies. For example, they stated that Dr. Labwani was charged with forming an organisation without legal permit. This was never a charge that was brought against him. They stated that Dr. Labwani secretly received funding from foreign organisations that opposed Syria. The security agencies tried to persuade one of Dr. Labwani's friends to give evidence to this effect. But when the friend left Syria, rather than give false evidence, the charge was never brought. They also stated that Dr. Labwani punished false information on the internet in order to affect the morale of the country, but no mention of the internet was made at his trial. They stated that Dr. Labwani was put on trial for affecting the morale of the country, for harming the standing of the state and weakening national sentiments. But in fact, he was sentenced to 12 years for inciting a foreign country to acts of aggression against Syria, although no evidence was brought to support this accusation. Also, the warrant for his arrest was not issued until 3 days after he had been picked up at the airport. It contained no charge, there was no signature, all there was just a number. From this, it seems apparent to me that the Syrian government has such contempt for its judicial system that it does not bother to keep accurate records of charges brought against the prisoner. It would appear to be concerned only with the usually predetermined verdict. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention did, in September 2008, declared Dr. Labouane's arrest and detention to be arbitrary and called for his immediate release. Shortly after his initial trial, Dr. Labouane was brought from prison to appear before the military court, which sentenced him to an additional 3 years for insulting the president and 4 other offences because of things he was alleged by other prisoners to have said inside his prison cell. I would like to conclude by reading a message which has been passed to me by this very brave young lady, a female lawyer in Syria, who puts her life and safety at risk every day. She has sent me this message from Enough Silence. It's an international campaign begun by human rights defenders in Syria who are calling for the immediate release of all Syrian political prisoners. This is the message they've asked me to read. We would like to thank MEP Donskis for hosting this hearing at this crucial time. It is now evident that the hopes of the nascent Syrian civil society, which peaked during the first years of Bashar al-Assad's presidency, have been systematically crushed under a regime which continues to oppress, arrest, and harass all independent voices that call for freedom and justice. Since that brief opportunity, conditions have deteriorated rapidly. In today's Syria, dozens of activists and reformers are serving long-term prison sentences. Thousands more are detained arbitrarily each year. Human rights defenders are consistently banned from travel, and young bloggers like Tal Malahin and Ayat Ahmad, both 19-year-old girls, are being summarily arrested by security forces and disappeared, never heard from again. Syria has again become a kingdom of silence. Yet despite these harsh conditions, Syrian human rights activists continue to work for change and take incredible risks to fight for freedom and justice. We do not want to spend time enumerating the violations committed by the Syrian regime, but rather focus on the question of what Europe can do to help. Freedom and human rights are universal values that Europe should promote and defend worldwide. Europe should join our call for reform and make it clear to the Syrian regime that the international community has seen enough of emergency law, enough arbitrary arrests, enough political prisoners. Freedom of expression, association, and human rights should remain a priority during all talks with the Syrian regime and during negotiation of the association agreement. The release of human rights lawyers Mohammed al-Hassani and Haytham Maleh and physician Kamal Labouane should be a condition for any constructive discussion with the Syrian regime. The Enough Silence campaign calls on the European Parliament to be vocal about the human rights situation in Syria, and we call on the Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights to visit Syria as soon as possible. We ask that the Delegation for Relations with Mashrek countries addresses human rights abuses explicitly and publicly when they visit Syria on May the 25th. We ask that the European Parliament and European NGOs send lawyers to Syria to monitor the trials of Mohammed al-Hassani and Haytham al-Maleh. We greatly appreciate your support for prisoners of conscience in Syria. Sincerely, Kafa Samtan, Enough Silence. And I personally appeal to all of you who are in a position to make decisions regarding Europe's relationship with Syria. Please remember what history has taught us, that turning a blind eye to the deeds of despotic dictators does not deliver long-term benefits to anyone. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Maureen, for this very concise and comprehensive overview. I just want to point out that we have the UN opinion on the arbitrary working group in copy on the table on behind on the right side of the door. So everybody, please feel free to take a copy with you. And I would now like to give the floor to Maleh for his remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Roberta. Thanks the European Foundation for Democracy and MEP Leonidas Donskis for organizing this event. Thank you all for coming. The Syrian Military Criminal Court has handed a slow death sentence to Maleh while the Western world is waiting for the trial to start before they issue a public position statement on this humanitarian case. The man I'll be speaking to you about today is a very well-known man in Syria, a prominent lawyer and a human rights defender. He's a 78-year-old man who is being referred to by a lot of people who knows him inside and outside Syria as a hero. The Syrian Sheikh of jurists, the Mandela of Syria, the Gandhi of Syria. The list goes on and on. This man happens to be my father. And I'm very proud to be his son. Although I'll be covering mainly my father's case in this presentation, but I want you to keep in mind that this is not a single case, but rather a systematic aggression by the Syrian government against its people. And it will become evident at the end of my presentation. Syria has been living under an emergency law since 1963, after the military coup d'etat of the Ba'ath Party on March 8, 1963. Syria signed to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on April 12, 1969, and the Covenant Against Torture on August 19, 2004. Yet, as we see below, it is not meeting its obligation. The systematic attack against the judicial system started right after the Ba'ath Party came into power, as I mentioned earlier, on March 8, 1963. In 1957, Mr. Maleh started his career as a lawyer. In 1958, he became a judge. But following a decree issued by the Syrian government in 1966, he, among 24 other judges, lost his tenure as a magistrate. This measure was due to his opposition to the government since his election on March 8, 1963, to serve on a committee to discuss the emergency laws, which had led to the arrest of tens of thousands of civilians and the attack on the Umayyad mosque by the military. Since 1966, he has returned to his practice as a lawyer. This has proven to be the first major blow to weaken the judicial system and clears it from any opposition to the Ba'ath Party. Those who issued the decree claimed that those dismissed persons did not accord well with the revolution. Mr. Maleh stated in an interview following his presentation at the German Parliament that his principal opposition to the government relates to the issue of human rights, the independence of the judicial branch from the executive branch and the legislative branch, and the superiority of the Constitution. He has been monitoring and advocating on these issues inside and outside Syria for many years. Since his early age, he has been very vocal on issues like the state of emergency, the death penalty, political prisoners, women's rights, and children's rights. In 1980, while Mr. Maleh was serving as a member of the Civil Liberties and Human Rights Committee and the president of the Lawyers' Social Welfare Committee within the Syrian Bar Association, he was arrested among 50 other lawyers throughout Syria for passing the Bar Resolution number 1, calling for an end to the state of emergency, and a petition to President Assad, the father, to free prisoners of conscience and send detainees to trials, and organizing a one-day strike at the Palace of Justice in Damascus on April 15, 1980. Among those arrested in Damascus on the same day were Mr. Sabah Rikabi, the president of the Syrian Bar Association, Muwaffaq al-Din al-Kuzbari, Dr. Rashad Barmada, Michel Arbash, Muhammad al-Hamoud, Adnan Arabi, and Bahjat al-Musuti. Continuing the crackdown, the Council of Ministers dissolved all professional associations on April 9, claiming they had been infiltrated by reactionary elements and were dangerous to the society. Officials closed down the national and local bars. The next day, officials presented new bar associations with newly appointed officers and executive councils. Nothing like this ever happened in the history of Syria, and this proving to be the second major blow to the independence of the judicial system. The lawyers quickly mobilized international support for their cause. The Arab Lawyers Union executives meeting in Morocco in June refused to recognize the newly appointed officers of the Syrian bar. Soon afterwards, the ALU Congress declared the government's actions null and void. Other international legal bodies protested as well. Eventually, those actions led to the freedom of detainees lawyers 7 years later at the end of 1986. Keep in mind there was no trials or even accusations against the lawyers. During his detention, Mr. Haytham Maleh developed several medical problems and underwent an eye surgery and has been taking medications on a regular basis since his release for an overactive thyroid gland that causes severe weight loss in a short period of time if it is not treated on a regular basis, and diabetes. In 2001, the Syrian Bar Association started a disciplinary action against Mr. Haytham Maleh to ban him from practicing law for 3 years because of statements he made to the media in regards to the case of his client, Mr. Ma'mun al-Humsi, a parliamentarian who was in detention. And as we see today, a similar action was taken against Mr. Muhammad al-Hassani, who is being detained and facing trial as we speak for monitoring and reporting on public trials held at the State Security Council, which is an exceptional court. That action by the Syrian Bar Association against Mr. al-Hassani resulted in a decision to disbar him from practicing law in Syria forever. In 2002, while Mr. Haytham Maleh was in Qatar for an interview on Al Jazeera TV, a warrant for his arrest was issued by the Syrian government. But after his return to Syria, accompanied by international diplomats as observers, he was subpoenaed to appear in front of a military court instead and was not arrested upon his arrival. In July 2003, a presidential pardon covered Mr. Haytham Maleh. He was accused of unlicensed publication, which is the publication they print in the Human Rights Association of Syria, and broadcasting news outside the country that undermined the sovereignty of the state, as well as founding a political society of international characteristic, which is the Human Rights Organization of Syria. The publication is Tayarat, Trends, a magazine which is published by the Human Rights Association of Syria and printed in Beirut, Lebanon, because they were not allowed to print it in Syria. In 2004, Mr. Haytham Maleh was banned from travel after he returned to Syria from Germany, where he delivered a speech on the human rights situation in Syria at the German parliament. And today, the list of activists banned from traveling outside Syria reaches the hundreds. In March 2006, Mr. Maleh received the Guzen Medal Award, and it was presented to his son on his behalf by the Dutch then Prime Minister, Mr. Ben White. Since Mr. Maleh was still under travel ban and was not allowed to travel to receive his award, but he was able to attend the ceremony via an internet satellite uplink at the Netherlands Embassy in Donskis. The Guzen Medal is awarded each year by the Guzen Resistance of 1940-1945 Foundation to a person or organization which has made a special contribution to the defense of democracy or against dictatorship, discrimination, or racism. In May 2006, Mr. Haytham Maleh was sentenced to 10 days in jail by military court for having insulted the president or a public official That decision was appealed by Mr. Maleh, but his ban from travel has not been lifted until today. In February 2009, the Syrian Bar Association concluded a disciplinary action against Mr. Muhammad al-Hassan by disbarring him because he co-founded a human rights organization called Sawasiya and was observing public trials at the State Security Court without permission from the Syrian Bar Association. Mr. Haytham Maleh was defending Mr. Muhammad al-Hassan since his arrest on July 30th, 2009. And he wrote an article that discussed his case, titled Regression, which became a topic during his interrogation. On October 12, 2009, Mr. Haytham Maleh was interviewed over the phone by Barada TV, a satellite station based in London. In his interview, Mr. Maleh discussed the deteriorating human rights situation in Syria, the corruption, and how to clean it up by saying that when people need to clean their stairs, by cleaning it, they clean it from the top down and not from the bottom up. And finally, raise the awareness on the need to break the barrier of fear by saying that people need to learn what their rights are and how to defend them. On October 13, 2009, an officer from the political security, this is the next day, the following day, telephoned Mr. Haytham Maleh and told him to report to the political security branch in Damascus. Mr. Maleh refused to go, as he normally does in similar circumstances. At 2 p.m. on October 14, 2009, the following day, Haytham Maleh left his office, and while he was unlocking his car door to go home, 3 young men overpowered him and forced him into their car. And took off speeding to the General Intelligence Building, State Security, in Kafar Sousa, kidnapping Mr. Maleh and forcing his disappearance for 8 days, until he was brought in front of a military judge on Monday, October 23, 2009. Mr. Haytham Maleh's prison condition is horrible, to say the least. The prison cell is about 60 square meters, shared with 60 other ordinary prisoners. For a prisoner to go to the bathroom, he must step over bodies laying down on the floor. Mr. Maleh sleeps on a thin mattress on the floor. He is denied access to his medications. His lawyers are not able to speak to him freely. Mr. Maleh is always accompanied by a prison guard, unlike other prisoners. When visiting the prison doctor, Mr. Maleh is denied access to any reading materials and not allowed to visit the prison library. Any other prisoners is able to do that. I would like also to refer to Syria's obligations under Article 12 of the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which states that they are obliged to respect Mr. Maleh's right to health and should provide him with the appropriate medical services and attention, and as laid out in the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. The UN Economic and Social Council Resolution 663, July 31, 1957, and Resolution 2076 of May 13, 1977. Mr. Muhammad al-Hassani's prison condition and treatment are very similar to those of Mr. Maleh, as mentioned earlier. Lately, 2 Italian lawyers were in Damascus to observe his trial, were not allowed to enter the courtroom. Diplomats and international observers are being denied access to Mr. Haytham Maleh's trial. A few days ago, Mr. Muhammad al-Hassani received the Martin Ennals Award for 2010. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate him and his family on the well-deserved honor. Yet another case, similar to those 2 cases that I mentioned earlier, is Mustafa Ismail, a Kurdish lawyer detained in Aleppo on December 12, 2009, was referred to the military judge in Aleppo. He was questioned by the general military attorney in Aleppo on March 23rd and was transferred to the central prison in Aleppo. He was accused of undermining the authority of the state and broadcasting false news he has been actively working in the field of law and human rights. The day before he was detained, Mustafa Ismail had posted an article on the London-based Levant News website in which he said he had been ordered to go to the Air Force Security Branch in Aleppo, commenting that he could easily get into the Guinness Book of Records because of the number of times that he had been summoned to report to security officers since 2000. And finally, the case of Anwar al-Bunni, another lawyer who was detained in 2006 and is serving a 5-year sentence now for spreading false news that could weaken the national morale. In February 2010, the non-independent Syrian Bar Association issued the following memorandum. Lawyers shall not nominate himself or accept any position or membership of an office or to continue his membership in an organization or association of lawyers and jurists who are Arab or international except after obtaining a written approval from the union issued by a decision of its board. And consequently, we emphasize the need to provide a formal written request before a period of no less than a month to be referred by the branch to which the lawyer belongs to the Central Union for submission to the board in order to take the appropriate decision, even for participating in forums and conferences, be it internal or external or otherwise, under penalty of disciplinary action. So anything the lawyer has to do, he has to take a permission from the Lawyer Bar Association. This shows clearly how the Bar Association has become an arm of the state security and intelligence forces. I'm going to conclude now by my presentation by reading a letter my father wrote in prison and addressed it to the European Parliament, and I think there are copies also if anybody would like to copy afterwards. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, October 14, 2009, while I was about to get into my car to return home, I was jumped by 3 young men who had stopped their car along the side of my car. They used their full force to push me inside their car. They did not allow me to put some clients' files in my car. They did not identify themselves, nor who they belong to. I was treated very roughly. They drove towards an unknown direction until I found myself at the General Intelligence Building, State Security. And they pulled the car into the building. I was escorted to the office of Major General Zuhair Hamad, Deputy Director of the General Intelligence, who led my operation leading to my arrest. I was interrogated by the Major General and 2 other people beside him. They were trying to scare me and terrorize me. Then they started to ask me questions about the Barada TV interview. Then about some articles I published on the internet. That continued until almost midnight. And then they put me in their detention room, where I stayed there until Monday morning, October 19, 2009. I was taken to the military court, and since the prosecutor was busy and did not have time, I was taken to the military police detention center in a very horrible situation. It's too hard to describe, full of insects and bad smell, and I stayed there until Wednesday, October 21st, 2009. I was taken again back to the military court, and I was interrogated then by the military prosecution, and then he handed me a warrant that would cover my previous arrest and detention, which is illegal. The prosecutor office representative then told me, why do you curse at us, since he is from the Ba'ath Party? And I talked about the Ba'ath Party in my TV interviews on Barada. I spent 4 days from the morning of October 18th until October 21st without food, and I have been without medications since October 14th, and the prosecutor refused to allow me access to medications that my wife brought to me on that day. On the evening of October 21st, I was moved to the Damascus Central Prison in Adra, and I was put among criminals, murderers, and thieves in a very horrible situation where I sleep on the floor, taking turns with others as I do not have a bed. And 5 months have passed on my illegal detention. And I still do not know when I will be set free. The detention, in principle, is a precautionary measure with the purpose of ensuring the safety of the investigation and for the accused not to run away and escape. And neither of these cases apply to me. It is well known now that the investigation files does not include much, only the documents containing my views. Plus, I'm a well-known prominent lawyer and cannot escape, and my place of stay is also known. The continued intransigence of the authority to arrest and detain me, and I am arrested under the pretext of the existence of a warrant by the military justice. But this is a lame excuse, and it is not supported. The international community, the Human Rights Council, and human rights organizations are obliged to move quickly to put pressure on the Syrian authorities for my release, as well as to consider all other actions void based on the above. So I send you this letter, hoping that justice is done, and to consider the rights of Syrian citizens who are filling the prisons. This was written in Damascus on March 29, 2010. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Iyas. Before moving to the two other speakers, I want to first ask the assistant of Mr. Donskis, Simona, to read a brief statement on Maleh and the other human rights imprisonment.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Leonidas, who is hosting this conference, regrets that he is unable to be here because he organized an urgent press conference in Lithuania on some worrying developments. This directly relates to his work as a coordinator in the Subcommittee of Human Rights. But this is the only thing keeping him from this conference, and he has left a note for me to read. I will read it. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I was deeply moved by the story of Haitham al-Maleh, an imprisoned human rights defender in Syria, which I heard from his son, Ilyas al-Maleh. I am honored by Mr. al-Maleh's trust in me, since he chose me as an ally in our joint dedication to the fight for human rights and human dignity. I am grateful for his commitment and readiness to address my colleagues in the European Parliament today concerning our ability to help a human rights defender and political prisoner in Syria's jail. I also believe that dear colleagues Malik Al-Abdeh from the Movement for Justice and Development, and Marie Thomas from Amnesty International, as well as Mr. Gregor Atteri, will allow us and have allowed us to have a glimpse of what is happening with other human rights defenders and political prisoners in Syria's jails. Finally, I would like to sincerely thank Daniel Radvetter from the European Foundation for Democracy for co-organizing and moderating this session. I was struck by the story of a courageous and patriotic lawyer who spent so much of his life fighting for democracy and human rights in this country. That a dissenting intellectual and a patriot of Syria should suffer in a prison cell without our voices clearly and unequivocally raised in his defense is unjust and regrettable. Working in the field of human rights teaches us a fundamental lesson, namely that a timely and practical support and help to a human rights defender and social activist means incomparably more than engaging in beautiful and sonorous, yet in effect empty rhetoric. I would like to do justice to a brave and dedicated person, yet most of all, I would like to help him get out of prison to which he was confined by Syrian authorities. Hence, my appeal and call upon my colleagues in the European Parliament who work in the EU Mashrek delegation and who have expertise in the region to join our hands in efforts to help a fearless human rights activist and his loyal family members. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank all of you who have gathered here today and who are prepared to listen to those who do their utmost to help Haitham al-Maleh and other Syrian human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Maleh. Maleh, please.
I'm going to try to cut this short because we're running out of time. Thank you all for attending. The title of this, the meeting today poses the question, what can Europe do? And I don't intend to lecture anyone, but simply to share some thoughts about my country and how human rights and democracy can be promoted. We've heard from Maureen and Iyas, how terrible the situation for human rights is in Syria, and perhaps for some of you it's not very shocking. What is perhaps surprising to some, or at least some of you in this room, is the obvious failure of Bashar al-Assad to improve human rights and loosen the restrictions on political freedoms during his 10-year reign. In fact, the situation has gotten worse, where not only opposition activists are being imprisoned, but also their lawyers as well. We believe this represents a very dangerous escalation in the regime's war against opponents, and obviously needless to say, the high hopes placed in the much touted reforms, Bashar's reforms, have been smashed to 1,000 pieces. The question obviously that perhaps some of you might be asking is, why has this happened? Why this reform has not taken place? I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the Syrian regime by some external players, which has led to perhaps wrong policy conclusions and perhaps a cycle which prolongs the life of the regime rather than shortens it. The main issue here is to do with political legitimacy. Bashar al-Assad inherited from his father not only a totalitarian state with a crumbling economy, he also handed down unresolved the key problem for this regime, which is how to attain popular legitimacy. In a country where the last true free and fair election took place in 1962, the regime's legitimacy and its rule, brutal rule, has always informed its internal and foreign relations. The way that the legitimacy dilemma has been addressed for decades has been twofold. First of all, the regime maintains a no war, no peace situation in relation to Israel. The second is to meddle in the affairs of neighboring countries through proxy groups. This dual policy has served the regime well over the years. Maintaining a state of war while expressing interest in peace has kept Western leaders flocking to Damascus, obviously in the vain hope that they will convince its leaders to sign a peace treaty. If and when Western leaders decide that there is not much point in talking with Assad anymore, or engaging with Syria, or worse, even to try to isolate Syria, the meddling in the affairs of neighboring countries quickly grabs their attention, and the spotlight is once again on Damascus as envoys come and go to seek Syria's help in resolving whatever crisis that happens to be raging in Lebanon, Iraq, Gaza, Yemen, and wherever else. So the sole purpose of this exercise, as far as the Syrian regime is concerned, is to obtain legitimacy from abroad. Obviously, given the lack of democratic legitimacy, or any other form of legitimacy, there are other forms of legitimacy, hereditary legitimacy in the case of Jordan and Morocco, tribal legitimacy in some Gulf countries. Obviously, in Syria, there's a clear lack of legitimacy, and obviously there's a sectarian issue as well in relation to Syria. And obviously the failure of the regime to improve the lives of ordinary people. The only source of legitimacy left is international recognition, or comes to international recognition and acceptance of its own existence. It's basically simple as saying, you know, if the USA and the EU do business with us, then we are the legitimate government of Syria. Now, what's this got to do with human rights and EU policy? The deteriorating human rights situation in Syria and escalation in the clampdown on not only the peaceful and intellectual opposition represented by the Damascus Declaration, but also their lawyers as well, is an indication that the regime is feeling very insecure. Bashar is no longer satisfied by silencing those who call for reform, but he has gone for their lawyers as well. He has done this because he doesn't want the Syrian people and also the international community to hear about the farcical show trials that are happening in Syria now. He does not want you to hear that his security apparatus is going about arresting 19-year-old girls. Because maybe, just maybe, people will reach the conclusion that actually his regime is very brittle and is not very popular. It does not have the support of the silent majority in Syria, and it's in fact detested alone. Perhaps given, might indicate that the Syrian people will overthrow him, given half a chance, like what happened to other dictators like Ceausescu. These brave human rights lawyers, one of whom is, of course, Maleh May, who's in his late 70s, who are going about their business diligently and legally and in the full glare of the secret police, who are chipping away ever so slowly at the false aura of Bashar al-Assad, the international statesman. Bashar al-Assad, the Lion of Damascus, standing up to Zionist aggression. Bashar al-Assad, the legitimate president of Syria. And they exposed him for what he really is. Bashar al-Assad, the tormentor of young girls and old age pensioners. I believe that when the EU set itself on a course of engagement with Syria, it did so with the best possible intentions. Its aims were never to prop up an alien dictatorship or to offer a discredited regime a lifeline of international legitimacy. And I do see the difficulty, of course, of dealing with a regime like Syria. If you ignore it, you get chaos in the Middle East, and if you help it or engage with it, you're helping to extend its life. It's a genuinely difficult dilemma, and I cannot offer a hard and fast solution to resolve it. What I can say is that the current policy of raising the issue of human rights with Syrian officials on the sideline of meetings is simply not working. That does not mean that it should not go on. I believe that you should continue raising these issues. But obviously, the response by these officials tends to be very inevitable and predictable, which goes something along the lines of nobody's in a position to lecture us on human rights, you should look at what's happening in Israel, and so on. Obviously, in the way that different European nations are dealing with Syria differently, without a clear EU policy guideline, is obviously also an issue of concern. Most recently, Bulgaria visited Syria and they promised them a lot of things, so obviously this gives the impression from Syria that the whole of the EU is on board. To support the human rights cause or human rights community in Syria, I think the EU should be bolder in seeking to gain leverage over Syria. I've heard it said from the EU Commissioner that the EU does not have a carrot and stick policy, only carrots and larger carrots. Last year, the EU spent 210 million euros in grants and loans to Syria. So perhaps the carrots are just not tempting enough, but given the choice between a carrot and a smaller carrot, or better still, no carrot at all, I think the regime would prefer having the carrot, however small. And I think it's in this way that perhaps the EU can make some inroads in relation to human rights and also other issues of regional and international concern. Making some of these huge loans and guarantees conditional upon improvement in human rights, I think, could be the way forward. Of course, there is also always the chance that the Syrian regime may reject, just as it has rejected the association agreement. But I think this will be Syria's loss, not the EU's. I think the EU is in need of every euro it can get hands on now to prop up the currency. And incidentally, I mean, I think should worth mentioning that the Syrian economist who helped draft the final wording of the association agreement has been fired in January of this year. He drafted it with Hugo Mingarelli because he criticized Bashar's economic policies. Finally, I don't want to go on for much longer. I would urge greater liaison and communication between the EU institutions, national governments, and also the US as well. I think the problem, as far as a lot of observers, myself included, is that there is a lack of coherent Syria policy across the board, whether it's by national governments, EU, or even the US. And perhaps a good start is to actually have a coherent policy in place, and that cannot be manipulated or changed by the Syrians. Thank you very much.
Malek, thank you very much. And in order to lose a good lot of time, I was asked Gregor now to give his speech. And maybe I can ask you also to be brief because we are a bit short on time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I will also make it shorter. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to raise our concerns, not only on the situation of human rights in Syria, but also on the EU policy towards Syria, because I think we are in a very specific context, and I would like to start by highlighting three components of this context. First, of course, the general deterioration of the human rights situation in Syria in the last 12 months, but also the preparation of the EP delegation's visit to Syria, which is key, and I'll come back to this. And third, the context of a further engagement of the EU with Syria in the final or potentially final phase of negotiation and signature of the association agreement. And I think in this framework we have to, and the European Parliament has to question the consistency of the EU policy. And I will describe later what we consider as serious political and strategic mistakes by the EU in the last months in its relation with the EU. And in this context, I'll come back to it, I'll be very direct. The European Parliament has a moral obligation to succeed where the member states are currently failing. That's absolutely key. And that's why there is a message to be passed to all the political groups, and this is the following, that there are very high expectations around the European Parliament's capacity to raise public political attention on the situation where the member states are not able to do so. And there are also very high expectations around the EP delegations to Mashrek's visit to Damascus. So I will very quickly, because that's not the main part of my intervention, come back to the situation, because I have to. As I was saying, the situation of human rights in Syria drastically deteriorated in the last 12 months. During the year, the Syrian authorities, and in particular members of the security forces, committed numerous serious human rights abuses. And in the general climate of full impunity, there were instances of arbitrary or unlawful deprivation of life. I'd just like to remind also that on March 21st, 2010, the Syrian security forces left at least one person dead and other wounded at Kurdish New Year celebration in northern Syria. And the violence, again, against any Kurdish protest or even gathering or celebration is recurrent. We are extremely concerned, of course, and this was raised today by the situation of human rights defenders in Syria, where dozens of human rights defenders and democracy activists are detained. I will not go into details. I just end with the situation and then move to the EU policy by saying that in this context, the situation of Mr. Hassani and Mr. Al-Mali is only the latest illustration of repression against human rights defenders, which takes many forms and tends to prevent defenders from continuing their activities. Some have been sentenced in recent years to heavy prison sentences, and Kamel al-Labouani was sentenced to 12 years in prison in May 2007. But now I would like to come back to the EU policy in those last month. I just have to mention before that since November 2009, the FIDH has sent 4 trial observation missions in Damascus, and there will be a report coming next week on this. But this has allowed to highlight, and that's obvious, the numerous violations of the right to fair trials, with general trends that will be documented in the report. But let's come back to the EU policy. We are extremely concerned by the lack of public political attention given by the EU on this very preoccupying situation. And this was especially true on the eve of what was supposed to be the signature of the association agreement, and that finally never happened, or happens only on one side, and that's a dramatic mistake. We first deeply regret that the unilateral commitment taken by the 27 member states in their GATT conclusions in October to sign the agreement, because by doing so, the European Union deprives itself of any leverage for change and open a room for instrumentalization by Syrian authorities. And I'll come back to this because we have this week a very concrete example of instrumentalization of this decision by Syrian authorities. In October, we invited a number of human rights defenders and the brother of Leonidas and the lawyer Kafin Al-Thani. And they clearly mentioned that they were not against the signature of the association agreement, but that they pay very high attention to the way the EU is going to engage with Syria. If you look at the press release of the GATT conclusions of October, you will be very surprised to note that that the decision to sign the agreement was not accompanied by any political declaration on the human rights situation. On the contrary, you will note in this press release of 27th of October 2009 that while quoting 5 aims of the agreement, the GATT conclusions do not make any reference to the respect of human rights and democratic principles. So the public or the private argument of the EU is that the association agreement is the leverage for change in the field of human rights. But among the 5 aims publicly stated of this association agreement, there is no reference to human rights. Another example of this inconsistency is the visit of Ms. Ashton to the region. A few weeks before her visit, the FIDH, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, many other international NGOs all sent the same message. You have to visit Syrian human rights defenders, you have to visit the families of the detained human rights defenders, and you have to formally request an access to the human rights defenders, because none of the EU diplomats have access to the detained human rights defenders and political prisoners. Ms. Ashton did not meet with the human rights defenders nor with the family, but she did not even give a proper answer to the request of all those NGOs to raise this issue. The result of all this inconsistency in the member states' policy is that the EU is committed to sign the agreement, and on the other hand, the Syria is free to act however it wants without any potential pressure, because the EU doesn't want to put additional pressure by fear that the agreement is never signed. And I'll give a very sad and concrete example of this. This week only, the Syria was presenting its report to the UN Committee Against Torture in Geneva. And during the session, when they were interviewed by the independent experts, the Syrian delegation explicitly stated that the EU unilateral commitment to sign the association agreement, taken by 27 member states, was a demonstration of the good situation of human rights in Syria. And that's where we stand today. We have a formal commitment to sign the agreement. We have a publicly stressed will to engage, and we have, on the other hand, no public expression of concern to the human rights situation, and then the Syrian regime is very cleverly playing the game of instrumentalization of the EU policy. So in this context, and that's why I was saying that we have very high expectations towards the European Parliament, there was a first very positive step, which was the adoption of a resolution on human rights in Syria, and especially on the case of Mohammed al-Hassani in September 2009. So that's a first positive step. But our recommendations will be the following. First, for the EP delegation visits to Damascus. It's absolutely key that they meet with human rights defenders, and all our NGOs are ready to facilitate this. This is not an easy thing to do, but this is feasible, and the human rights defenders are looking for those meetings. So, meeting with human rights defenders. Request access to the detained human rights defenders and political prisoners. This is absolutely key, and the MEPs should meet with the EP delegation and the embassies on the ground to put pressure on the EU delegation so that they still request access to those detained prisoners. Then, when they will be back from Damascus, and there will be a key stake in terms of follow-up, we ask the MEPs to call upon the Spanish presidency to draft and release an EU statement on the situation of human rights in Syria, with a specific focus on the detained human rights defenders. This is key because this would finally potentially put an end to the absence of public political existence of the EU on this issue. Second, to urge the member states to adopt a roadmap on human rights, including concrete short-term, mid-term, and long-term objectives. Third, call on member states to undertake urgent specific demarches for the immediate release of Mohammed al-Hassani, Haytham al-Maleh, and all political prisoners. And last, and we already asked for this, and there are staff within the European Commission and even on the ground that would be ready to facilitate this, but there is a need for political will, to set up a meeting, a public meeting in Damascus with human rights defenders. Again, it's not easy, but this is feasible, where the EU and the local presidency in particular will explain how the upcoming association agreement will be a leverage for change and a leverage for the promotion of human rights and democratic principles in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, thanks for the many suggestions. It's certainly welcome. I want to open the floor now, so I would like to give everybody a chance to ask some questions. I think we have a very a good panel for asking questions on many different aspects of human rights and human rights defenders in Syria. So, anybody wants to start? Nobody? No. Okay.
I'm sorry.
One question. Can you?
Raise his hand to ask a question. My name is Adel, and I'm speaking of my capacity, personal capacity, as a Palestinian. Just one question. I want to express my solidarity with Mr. Yes, I understand fully the pain that you are feeling as somebody also who passed through the genocide in his life as a Muslim. Can you imagine how difficult it is for you? The situation that you are describing, it is a reality. Nobody's saying that there is no problems with the Middle East. You cannot hide, as we say in Arabic, the sun of the It is not only in Syria, but among all the Eastern countries. I do not want to minimize the importance of the Middle East and the solidarity to exert, the solidarity with these. Just a couple of remarks and then we come to my question. I hear two words from Nicolas' presentation, that constitutionalization and the consistency of the nuclear policy in the Middle East. And unfortunately, I would love it very much if the European Union would stick to the principles of the human rights with everybody, Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, because this would help a lot our countries to progress and to advance in the implementation of human rights agendas. But unfortunately, as you can see, that this question of human rights, unfortunately, it's not a precondition in the EU relations with other countries. Because if it would be the case, I think that the EU will not have a lot of relations with the Middle East, and will cut relations with a lot of countries in the Middle East. Because we are talking about the case in which this is maybe one of my questions: how many political prisoners are in Syria? What are the accusation? Because just beside Syria, I think of thousands of prisoners, and the EU is just not giving a lot of attention to these cases, which unfortunately is consistent in the EU policy, discredit the EU when it comes to human rights. Why not to sign the association agreement with Syria? Because of hundreds of political prisoners, but it happened in other countries, there are still thousands. Because of weapons of mass destruction, you don't want to sign the association agreement with Syria. This is the principle. Do it for everybody. Because Syria is occupying the land of somebody else. Fine. Do it. Do not sign this agreement with Syria, but do not do it with everybody. So this, unfortunately, for us as an Arab public opinion, it's not relevant when the EU is coming and raising an issue, unfortunately, a just issue of human rights in Syria, in the Palestinian territories, in Jordan, everywhere. Europe is losing of its credibility because of this double standard policy. So the inconsistency of the EU policies, the EU is the victim of that. So I would like to see the situation improving in other countries. The second issue, and I will come briefly to the end, is it is a just cause, your cause. But since the example of Iraq and what we saw in Iraq was an instrumentalization of the situation in Iraq, we become reluctant to the discourse, the just discourse of Arab peace, or Arab human rights defenders. So it's good to promote, to raise the voice of human rights in Nigeria. But at the same time, be careful that this will not be instrumentalized for the destabilization of the country, of the people. There should be means to dialogue with the regime to change its strategy. So this was to remark, because I'm referring to Mr. Malik remark saying that Syria is interested in maintaining the state of no peace and no war in the Middle East. I don't know, I don't have information, maybe we have more information. But to your acknowledge, Israel announced that it would give back the whole Golan Heights to Israel in exchange of a peace agreement. And this is my last question to Malik. Thank you very much. And courage for your case.
Thank you. So the question was to Malik, if I understood you
correctly. It was a question to Malik and a question on the numbers. Anybody can give us figures about the number of political prisoners in Syria?
Okay, Malik.
Regarding numbers, the number that comes to mind is
anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000. Those are the numbers I used to hear from my father before he was arrested.
you can't get an exact figure because there are many who are not declared, even the family don't know whether they're still alive or not.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, a cousin of mine got picked up from the street, kidnapped the same manner my father was kidnapped a few weeks ago, and nobody has issued any statement on him. We called his family, and his family is afraid. They say, don't talk about it, don't mention it. We don't know why he was picked up, and he still disappeared, but nobody knows why. So those people don't count, unfortunately.
Regarding the peace issue, yeah, I believe that Syria is interested in the peace process, but not actually achieving the peace itself. Because once it does achieve the peace itself, then there are a lot of internal issues that we need to tackle. You can no longer use the whole Israel, being a whole Israel pretext as a way of postponing these issues. And one of these course, political reform and human rights. So it's very convenient for the Syrian regime to maintain this no peace, no war situation. Whether Israel has given Syria an offer, well, if you recall, in Bill Clinton in his final days, he did try to negotiate peace, and it fell through. Now, who was to blame, or whether this is Israel's fault or Syria's fault, I think it's debatable. But what we do know for a fact is that the Syrian regime is very much against any Israeli-Palestinian peace effort, and it always tries to torpedo any talks. It has come out against indirect negotiations which are happening now. In fact, it's also against any kind of Fatah-Hamas reconciliation effort, and it's also tried successfully, unfortunately, to torpedo those talks, to stop any kind of improvement of relations between the different Palestinian factions. So, yes, Syria is interested, is not interested in any other side making peace with Israel. It's interested in having the door open to peace negotiations as a way of prolonging Western engagement with itself. And that's, unfortunately, this has been the situation since Henry Kissinger first began relations with Assad in 1975, 74, to this day.
Okay, thank you, Willie. Any more questions? Yes, dear lady.
Naila Fernando for the European Coalition for Israel. It's a very practical question. I just wanted to know on behalf of whom Mr. Al-Atta and Mr. Turi are speaking in this organization.
On behalf of FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights.
Yes, and it's the Movement for Justice and Development, the Syrian Opposition Party.
Thanks. Any more questions? So I see we have all satisfied your questions apparently. I might ask one question basically to conclude the panel, and it concerns sort of more the situation. For example, the Russian president was in Syria. I want to ask if there's also the possibility that Russian influence actually might help to lead towards a change of approach of the Syrian government, not only to human rights but also to other issues.
Yeah, I think Russia has got its own human rights situation, or something in Chechnya and so on. So I doubt very much, and I hope that I'm wrong, that that human rights should be very high up on the Russian government's priorities in their talks with Bashar al-Assad. And unfortunately, the situation also applies to Arab leaders, and also to Turkey. These countries have adopted a very sort of realpolitik approach, and they don't like to interfere in the what's perceived to be the internal affairs of Syria. So this is a dilemma that we faced. In fact, there have been several people who have called on Arab leaders to intervene in the case of Maleh, because it's such a clear-cut and an obvious case. It's a humanitarian case, so when they visit Bashar next time, they should raise that with him. But obviously, that hasn't happened. And the problem is that if the Syrian government perceives this as being interference in internal affairs, the next time an opponent of that particular regime is in prison, the Syrians will start, tit for tat. So, and I think the same thing applies for Russia. So, really the onus is on the EU primarily, to a certain extent the US as well, but also the EU primarily, because it does have, you must say, soft power, a lot of soft power. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are no questions. There's one. Okay, please go ahead, sir.
To Mrs. Thomas or anybody else, Prague, Belgium, eligible here. With an interest of 20 years, and I'm astounded of the silence always coming out from other countries than from Syria's southern neighbor. There are thousands of journalists who have free speech, who can say whatever you want, who have free education, multicultural, melting pot of the Middle East, I would say. Nothing comes out of many of these Arab Muslim countries. And I attributed it principally to lack of interest from our media. We are here in the European Parliament, and I have the privilege to work here in support the services only. These are all elected officials who have a basis. There's no better system in the world than the democratic system. But the people, my friends, my family, the people I work with have so little interest in these things. I visited Israel once in my life and I took up an interest there. And reading from one to the other, you want to read what's being written in the Arab newspapers, and it doesn't reach us. This is one of the reasons, obvious reasons, why no news comes out. However, the media are there. And my question is actually, I'm really struck by all these people explaining openly, but for a very few select people. I had expected to hear hundreds of people, like a big group. It's little interest, it's obvious. What can we do? Freedom of speech is non-existent. But would they refuse if we send journalists? Would they refuse if our embassies speak out? What would they do if we, free people, inside their borders, would speak out? Okay, we have to say we have to be careful, but they won't kill us. They won't, I expect, don't hurt us. They won't pick Belgians or English or Americans or Germans from the street, put them in a jail. They don't dare. But are there no people to dare to speak out? And to get in our newspapers, that my neighbors read what it's all about. And you don't have to look on the internet for specialized websites to find out how it is. Because you never will reach all the masses out there. In our country on the 13th of June, we have elections now in Belgium. People get moved about this. You reach people on the street. You reach 10.5 million Belgians and hundreds of millions of Europeans or Americans. Maybe things might change. You have to get us inside their borders. Good people, professionals. They will not risk the boat. Now, I would like to, what's your opinion on it? How do you feel about this? To have people send over there, dare you to speak out, and help you in all this? Like the United Nations, it's a bastion of these potentates, these autocrats. The United Nations, we saw the Goldstone report, and the European Union stood behind the Goldstone report. It's so individualistic, so it doesn't make any sense. We are hurting ourselves, I would say, but we need people to speak. May I have your opinion on that, please?
You're describing the problem I face every day. I'm not here as an official spokesman for the whole of Amnesty. I'm here because I do more work on the Syrian problem than anybody else. I know more about it. But for every email I send out, or I must send 50 or 60 emails and get one response. When we have demonstrations, you can't get the press along. You write to the press and they're not interested. And I mean, I would love to get inside Syria, but I did, together with a representative from Human Rights Watch and Frontline, get an interview with the Syrian ambassador to London. And I asked, could I have a visa to go? No, he said, not while you are an activist, you're not going to get a visa to go to Syria. And another interesting thing he said was, he said that he knew that if he was questioned on human rights, he would find it difficult to answer. But he's never questioned about human rights, not by the press and not by other people. And this is what I am trying to get attention. This is what I spend many hours each day trying to get attention for the situation in Syria. And people aren't interested. And if you can suggest an answer, I'd love to hear it.
I think we're in the best place in the world, or in Europe, to start something up. I was quite impressed with Mr. May's experiences. So many people I don't know, I just maybe 2 names, 3 names, but who am I? If it doesn't start here, it won't start anywhere. These people are desperate. They look upon us just like the former Soviet Union. 1989, in Germany, and they released, they let the Jews go, due to pressure, especially from, thanks to Mr. Reagan, who started things at the Evil Empire. They had to open the borders. If it happens there, why wouldn't it happen with Arab regimes? It's comparable. They are afraid of their own people. They are afraid of the truth. If the truth doesn't come out, there's no people to speak, to bring it out. These people must be desperate, living in insect-infested jails with 60 people. Are we being heard? They're not being heard.
Kamal's family are in touch with me very occasionally when they can risk it by email. And one night, soon after he'd been arrested, his youngest daughter emailed me. She calls me Grandma. And she said, Grandma, I'm emailing you because my mother has been arrested. It turned out that they accused her of filling in a tenancy agreement wrongly. Her mother had been taken away, and she and her young brother were alone in the house. And she said, I can hear dogs barking outside, and I can hear noise, and Omar and I are alone here, and I'm just writing to let you know what's happening in case. Well, luckily the mother was returned 24 hours later, and they were right. But that's the situation here, and then she had no one else that she dare contact except to send this email to me and then close the computer. And I just felt so helpless.
I understand your point. It should be the terrorists who are afraid, not the other way around. How to make the terrorists afraid? Well, maybe it will take a few decades, a few years, but let people start, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have run out of time, so I want to thank again everybody for coming. I hope it was interesting and you gained some key suggestions and ideas. I also want to thank again the Leonidas Donskis for hosting the meeting, and also Simona for helping to arrange a lot of things. So thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. And just a last note, we have some documents and some fact sheets which are on the table there, so please feel free to take them with you. And you can also contact us at our website, EUPdemocracy.org. So thank you very much again, and have a nice day. Bye.
I may mention 2 dates. Tomorrow is Mr. Maleh court hearing, and the next hearing for Mohammed Al-Hassan is May 27. So you can watch the internet and get the latest news on the hearing.